The intake sheet said returned, and under it, in a different pen, someone had written the number 22 and circled it twice. The dog behind the chain link had a torn ear that never healed right, and a way of flinching before anyone raised a hand, not after. He didn't bark when people passed his kennel. He'd learned that barking got him moved to the back row, the row nobody adopted from. So he lay against the concrete with his chin on his paws and watched the front doors the way a man watches an exit he doesn't expect to use. Nobody at Cascade County Animal Services called him hopeless out loud. They didn't have to. It was written into the schedule taped by the front desk, into the red sticky dot on his kennel card, into the quiet way the volunteers avoided his row on the days they let themselves feel things. His name was Sarge. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story finds you, stay with it until the end. Some stories take their time getting to the part that matters. Sarge had come through the shelter system the way a lot of washed-out working dogs do, bred for a job, trained for a job, and then handed to people who had no idea what to do with an animal built for structure once the structure was gone. He'd been a green canine candidate once, before a training injury to his hip ended that path early. Since then, he'd been adopted and returned 22 times in 4 years. Too much dog for apartment. Too quiet. Then, too reactive. Barked at the mailman. Didn't like children running. Didn't like men who raised their voices. Every file said something different. None of them said the truth, which was simpler and harder to write down. Nobody had stayed long enough to learn what he needed instead of what he'd failed to be. Rosa Delgado came into the shelter on a Tuesday in March, not looking for a dog. She was 58 years old, small and precise in her movements. With gray threaded through dark hair, she kept pulled back in a way that hadn't changed in 20 years. Her eyes were a deep brown that had gone somewhere private a long time ago and mostly stayed there. Not empty, just guarded. The way a house looks when the people inside have learned to keep the curtains drawn. She wasn't unfriendly. She'd simply run out of the kind of energy that makes a person open easily to strangers, and she'd made her peace with that a long time ago. She'd come to drop off dog food. Her neighbor ran the shelter's donation drive, and Rosa had promised a box of unopened cans left over from a dog that hadn't lived long enough to finish them. She hadn't planned on walking the kennel row. She did it anyway, the way people sometimes do when they're not ready to go home yet. Sarge didn't come to the front of his kennel like the other dogs. He watched her from the back, chin still on his paws. Rosa stopped in front of the enclosure longer than she meant to. Something about the stillness of him. Something about a dog who'd clearly learned that being seen wasn't always safe. She'd known that stillness before. She'd lived across a visitation table from it for 6 years. Her husband, Manuel Delgado, had been a corrections officer at the state facility in Deer Lodge for 11 years before the incident that ended his career, his freedom, and eventually, his life. A use of force case during a cell extraction that went wrong in ways the internal investigation never fully agreed on, resulting in an inmate's death and a conviction that Manuel always maintained didn't match what actually happened in that room. He spent 6 years on death row before a massive stroke took him 8 months before his final appeal was scheduled to be heard, a fact that still sat in Rosa's chest like a stone that never wore down. The county paper had run one paragraph. The story of what actually happened in that facility. The years of documented short staffing, the training failures, the men on both sides of the bars who'd been failed by a system that needed someone to blame quickly, had never made it into print at all. Rosa had believed him. She still believed him. She had spent 6 years learning what it meant to love someone the world had already decided about. and to keep showing up anyway, past the point where showing up made any obvious sense. She looked at the dog with the torn ear and the 22 returns, and something in her recognized something in him, and neither of them had the words for it yet. "What's his story?" she asked the volunteer. "Honestly, nobody stayed long enough to know," the volunteer said. "He's a good dog. He needs somebody who isn't going to give up in the first 2 weeks. Most people don't have that in them right now." Rosa didn't say anything for a long moment. "I might," she said. The shelter almost didn't approve the adoption. 22 returns had made Sarge a liability in their own paperwork, a dog they were required to disclose as a high-risk placement, and the intake coordinator, a heavyset man named Phil Anders, who had run the shelter for 11 years and had strong opinions about which dogs were workable, looked at Rosa's application and told her, not unkindly, that she should think about a dog that hadn't already broken 22 homes. "He hasn't broken 22 homes," Rosa said. 22 homes broke him. There's a difference, and I think you know it. Phil looked at her for a while. Then he looked at the dog, who had come to the front of the kennel for the first time that anyone could remember and was watching Rosa the way he hadn't watched anyone in longer than his file could account for. "3-day trial," Phil said. "That's the best I can do." The first night, Sarge didn't come near her. He stayed in the far corner of the small house outside Deer Lodge, near the back door, in the spot with the clearest line to the exit. Rosa didn't push it. She'd learned patience the hard way, across a visitation table, across appeals that took years to fail, across a marriage that had continued in letters and 15-minute phone calls, long after the world had stopped extending Manuel the benefit of the doubt. She knew what it looked like when someone was waiting to see if you'd actually stay. She left food near him. She didn't reach for him. She talked to him the way she used to talk to Manuel through the glass, steady, unhurried, saying ordinary things, because ordinary things were what proved you weren't going anywhere. On the 4th night, he lay down 4 feet closer. By the end of the 2nd week, he slept in the doorway of her bedroom instead of the far corner of the kitchen. Word travels fast in a small town, and Deer Lodge was smaller than most. Within a month, most of the town knew that Manuel Delgado's widow had taken in the shelter's hopeless case, the dog nobody could keep past a season. Some people thought it was sweet. A few thought it was strange, the widow of a disgraced corrections officer and a washed-out K-9 candidate, like two rejected things finding each other. Rosa heard the comments. She developed a fairly complete immunity to what people said about things they didn't understand. What she noticed, in the weeks that followed, was smaller and stranger than any of that. Sarge would not settle in a room until he'd checked every door. He would not eat until Rosa had eaten. He startled at raised voices in a way that went beyond ordinary dog nervousness, a full body flinch, ears back, a retreat toward the nearest wall, but he never startled at Rosa's voice, no matter how she raised it trying to call him in from the yard. He seemed, in a way she couldn't yet explain, to be listening for something specific, watching for a particular kind of danger, guarding against a threat that had a shape she hadn't identified yet. She didn't know yet what he was listening for. She would understand it later, and it would change how she saw both her husband's case file and the last 4 years of her own life. It was Dale Kessinger who told her, eventually, the town's retired postmaster, a slow-spoken man who delivered mail to half the county for 30 years, and knew things about the correctional facility's old training program that had never made it into any official record. He delivered mail to the K-9 training annex back when Sarge was still a candidate, still nameless in the county paperwork, still being run through obedience drills by handlers who rotated in and out too fast for any real bond to form. That dog, Dale said, standing on Rosa's porch on a gray afternoon in May, turning his cap in his hands the way men of his generation did when they were about to say something they'd been carrying. He washed out of the program the same month your husband's case went sideways. Same facility. I always wondered if that dog remembered more than anybody gave him credit for. Rosa felt something go still in her chest. "What do you mean?" she said. Dale told her what he knew, carefully, the way a man tells you something he's not entirely sure he should. The K-9 candidates had been housed and trained in the same wing that fed staff into cell extraction details, the same wing Manuel had worked. Dale didn't know exactly what Sarge had seen or heard in his months there. Dogs that age, that early in training, weren't supposed to remember anything specific. But Dale had delivered mail to that annex for years, and he said the dog that came out of it, skittish around raised voices, unable to settle near locked doors, flinching hardest at the particular cadence of men shouting commands in unison, had never behaved like a dog with nothing to remember. It wasn't proof of anything. Rosa knew that. It wasn't going to reopen a case that had already closed with her husband's death. But it was the first time in 6 years that anyone had suggested there might be a witness to what actually happened in that facility in the months before everything went wrong. Even a witness who couldn't testify, who could only flinch at certain sounds and refuse certain rooms and choose every single day to stay near a woman who reminded him, in some way even Rosa couldn't fully name, of steadiness that didn't disappear. She started writing again. Letters, this time not to Manuel, but to the state's Corrections Oversight Board, to the journalist who'd written the original paragraph and never followed up, to anyone who might still be willing to look at a 6-year-old case with fresh eyes. She attached nothing about the dog. She knew how that would read. But she attached everything else, the staffing logs Dale remembered, the training program records she'd requested and finally received, the pattern of short-staffed extraction details that 3 other former officers, once she started asking, admitted they'd also witnessed and never reported. It took 11 months. It did not overturn Manuel's conviction. The courts don't move that way, and Rosa had stopped expecting miracles of that particular shape a long time ago. But the Oversight Board issued a formal finding acknowledging systemic training and staffing failures at the facility during the period in question, and recommended a review of 3 other convictions from the same unit. It was not vindication. It was something smaller and, in its way, more honest, an acknowledgement, in writing, that the story had never been as simple as the version that convicted him. Rosa read the finding out loud on her porch on a warm evening in April, a year after she'd first walked past a kennel with a red sticky dot on the card. Sarge lay at her feet, head on her boot, in the particular position of full unguarded rest that had taken him 13 months to learn. "He'd have wanted you to know," she said to the dog, who did not understand the words, but understood. By then, everything that mattered about her voice. He always said somebody was going to have to be stubborn enough to keep asking. Sarge lifted his head and looked at her the way he'd learned to look at her, not scanning for danger anymore, not checking the exits, just looking. 2 years after that first Tuesday at the shelter, Rosa Delgado still lived in the small house outside Deer Lodge, though it looked different now. A new porch swing, a garden that hadn't existed when Manuel was alive, a dog bed by the fire that Sarge used maybe 1 night in 10 because he still preferred the doorway, still preferred to see every way in and out. He was 9 years old that spring, gray coming into his muzzle, slower on the hip that had ended his training career all those years ago. He still flinched at raised voices. He probably always would. But he ran across the back pasture most mornings chasing nothing in particular. Ears up, tail high, moving like an animal who had finally stopped waiting for the next return. Phil Anders retired from the shelter the following year and told anyone who'd listen that Rosa Delgado and that impossible dog were the reason he stopped believing any animal was a lost cause. He kept her adoption file in his desk long after he no longer needed to, the 3-day trial extension scrawled in the margin, because he liked being reminded that he'd almost said no. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in a courtroom, and it doesn't arrive on anyone's schedule. Sometimes it arrives slowly, over 13 months of a dog learning it's safe to sleep with its back to the door, carried by a woman who had already spent 6 years learning how to keep believing in someone the world had stopped listening to. Loyalty like that isn't naive. It's just patient in a way most of us have forgotten how to be. Rosa never got the version of justice she'd once hoped for. What she got instead was a dog nobody else would keep, a truth nobody else would chase, and the particular peace of knowing that some things, a marriage, a case, a wounded animal, are worth the 23rd try. Even after 22 failures. Even after everyone else has stopped counting. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes in the 23rd try. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if you've ever taken a chance on someone, or something everyone else had given up on, we'd like to hear that too. If you believe in patience, loyalty, and second chances that take longer than a season, consider following along for the next story. Wherever you are tonight, we hope something in this one stays with you.